Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. On today's show, our midweek show on this lovely Wednesday morning, we have a fantastic one. We are going to continue our player profile series, going to throw some running backs in there, along with some, shall we say, controversial QB choices, and I'm also going to throw in a little Euros talk as well as the group stages of that tournament wrap up today. But before we get into all of that, I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. Also, we do tend to receive a lot of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please leave them at the link gsmc.cloud. Let's wait a minute here as it pops up on my screen so you guys can see. gsmc.cloud is indeed the link. You can also leave questions, comments, or concerns that you have about any prior episodes or even segments from today's show that I will get to at the beginning of the next episode tomorrow. But without further ado, let's jump right into what should be a can't-miss show. We are going to start off, as we always do right now, with our player profile series. It's been a very exciting tradition that I've started here, where I get to talk and deep dive into players' fantasy stats and careers as a whole. It should be fantastic. We are starting off today with a very interesting pick to start off in Deshaun Watson. Now, a lot of people are saying that Deshaun Watson may not be a factor anymore in the fantasy realm, but I say maybe he is. This is going to be a very pivotal year for his development as a Cleveland Brown, because he really had any more of success in recent seasons. So, looking at Johnson as a fantasy QB at the moment, you might say that he's someone you tend to shy away from. But without further ado, here's some reasons why he might. So, his entire career, Deshaun Watson has accrued 1,362 fantasy points. His best season when it's last as Houston Texans, so that's reason for pause. 369.32 points there. So, as you can see, as a Houston Texan, Deshaun Watson was very desired as a fantasy option. But right now, as we can see over the years, he's not. And so here are the reasons as to why people have been skeptical and critical of him as a Cleveland Brown. Last year, he only completed 59.8% of passes actually over the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years as well, he's averaged 6.5 yards per attempt, not necessarily as high as someone of his caliber should attempt. He's only averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game as a Cleveland Brown. He has averaged a 4-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio over the past couple of years, which is his lowest, and it matched his 2022 season. So as you can see, those past 2 years as a Cleveland Brown, Deshaun Watson really has not established himself as someone that Cleveland can rely upon. His 61.4 completion rate last year only exceeded his 2022 mark. He had career lows in pass success rate, lows in yards per attempt last year, and lows in yards per completion. So very, very worrying. However, one thing that he has maintained coming over from Houston is his ability as a dual threat rusher. He's maintained those averages in rushing yards, and so there's reason for hope and optimism that should Kevin Stefanski want to focus on Deshaun Watson's overall play, not just as a passer but as a rusher, Deshaun Watson could thrive in a system like that. But the overarching theme surrounding Deshaun Watson right now is that he has not been able to sustain any level of brilliance from Houston to Cleveland, and that's where people stand with him right now. Now, talking about Deshaun Watson, and I'll go over his projections soon. Deshaun Watson, in my mind's eye, was never someone who searched for big plays. I think that Deshaun Watson, while electric in Houston, was someone who took what offensive gave him. He was decisive. He was brilliant in determining whether or not he should run or pass. The system around him in Houston, which had set up brilliantly for him to succeed. He comes to Cleveland And maybe it's all the turmoil and unrest surrounding him, the burden he's carrying as he went through those domestic abuse charges. But something did not click right away from him. There was a disconnect for Deshaun Watson as soon as he came to Cleveland, where he did not take any of the traits that made him what he was in Houston with him. And so it seemingly should have worked. Kevin Stefanski, one of the better offensive minds, also arrived at a similar time to him, and they came in together, and they're supposed to develop a rapport between coach and QB where Deshaun fits in perfectly with what Cleveland wanted. But right now, what we're staring at is a waste of money. $230 million guaranteed, and Deshaun Watson has given them nothing. And so that's the main issue. However, if we look at what people are projecting him to have next year, there's a steady improvement. Maybe not in terms of fantasy production, but at least in terms of the stats he provides to a team. 3,820 yards projected, 25 TDs, 14 interceptions, projected to only have 203.5 fantasy points next year. Also 349 rush yards and 2 rush TDs, if you are interested in those stats as well. One thing of note to remember, Deshaun Watson not only has dealt with those domestic charges, but also with amalgamation of injuries that really have impacted his play. Obviously last year with a shoulder injury, a couple of years ago another shoulder injury, and so perhaps another reason why people are wary of a player like Deshaun Watson is because he hasn't been able to stay on the field as much. And so that's another thing to look out for. If Deshaun Watson is fully healthy, maybe Kevin Stefanski can start there. Maybe Kevin Stefanski can say, okay, if you're fully fit, maybe we can start building something. Because in order for a quarterback to fully entrust their skill levels and traits, they need someone who is fully fit. They need that kind of health mindset to get in place for them. And so Deshaun Watson certainly feels like he needs that. But interestingly enough, in the game where he did get injured, he definitely played one of his best, at least halves, as a Cleveland Brown in recent memory. He completed all of his passes to lead them in that comeback victory over Baltimore. And so, if Deshaun Watson can carry that over from the game in which he was injured to what the Browns have around him right now, perhaps something gets going. Now, another reason as to why you should be wary of Deshaun Watson is obviously the division. The AFC North has turned into one of the best divisions in all of football, highly competitive. Each and every team, maybe apart from the Steelers, Steelers fans should be competing for a playoff spot. And that's the expectation for Cleveland. They have a roster that can compete in the playoffs. We saw it last year with Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco, I just think, ran out of gas a little bit, and the Texans looked like the far superior team in that playoff game. But they certainly have the pieces. They have the brilliant tight end in David Njoku. They added Jerry Jeudy from Denver. They still have Amari Cooper. They still have Elijah Moore, who I really like, in their backfield. We'll have to see how Nick Chubb comes back from injury, but pieces like Jerome Ford are very intriguing. I think that Jerome Ford can carry over his success from last year filling in for Nick Chubb to this season. So I'm not necessarily worried about the infrastructure. I'm worried about Deshaun. I'm also kind of worried about Kevin Stefanski's game plan here, because as much as I want to pin it all on Deshaun, pin it on the reason why he has failed to maintain his level of dominance that we saw in Houston, where he was consistently, at the very least, a top 5 quarterback, I'm also wary of how Kevin Stefanski operates. First year that Kevin Stefanski came in, Baker Mayfield looked like he was going to be a bust in the Cleveland system. However, Kevin Stefanski employed a system where Baker felt comfortable. Play action passes that got the ball out quickly. He wasn't under that much pressure, and he drastically improved as the season progressed, and they made a deep run in the playoffs as a result. Now that Deshaun Watson is here, I think that Deshaun Watson maybe felt like Kevin Stefanski is not the right fit for him. mainly due to the fact that Deshaun doesn't necessarily like structure. That's what I'm thinking about with Deshaun. Deshaun Watson wants to perform outside of structure. And Kevin Stefanski wants that offensive structure. He wants the timely play. He wants to be aggressive on early downs. And then he wants to pick you apart through play action bootleg RPOs. Deshaun Watson isn't necessarily that guy. I think Deshaun Watson is another one of those QBs that takes off of his own accord as a rusher, wants to pass mainly to advance the ball on the field, but also to kind of get as much yardage as possible. And so, as we're seeing in Cleveland at the very least, Deshaun Watson, when he's at his best, works out of structure. I think that in the second half against Baltimore, when they were trying to make this comeback, I think that's when Deshaun Watson pushed himself a lot. I think maybe Deshaun Watson needs to be in more pressure-cooked situations for him to thrive. It seems kind of weird saying that, but it certainly feels as if Deshaun Watson, in a weird way, feels like pressure is off him. And maybe that's why he's underperforming. Because Deshaun Watson always loves pressure. We saw it at Clemson. We saw it in Houston. Time and time again, Deshaun Watson was the bailout guy, the guy that got you out of jail free. In Cleveland, he's not expected to be that. He's just expected to, A, fit in the system of that Kevin Stefanski implements, and B, try and make it so that Cleveland has a sustainable advantage before anyone can even think about coming back on them. That's what Kevin Stefanski wants, but I'm not sure what Deshaun Watson wants. And that disconnect between coach and QB is very intriguing. In terms of fantasy, I think that Deshaun is still a player who has enough juice in him that you might consider him in at least a super flex league. But it all depends on what Kevin Stefanski wants and not what he wants, because the Browns have it. They have the system that Deshaun Watson needs to succeed. But does Deshaun Watson want to succeed in the system? That is the question we ultimately have to ask of him before we really, truly get back to saying Deshaun Watson is someone I'm comfortable with rostering for my fantasy squad. But that should just about do it for this segment of my player profile series. Coming up next, we go to one of the most intriguing sophomore quarterbacks of this year. We'll be right back to discuss him and all his fantasy stats on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.